right. What is up, baseball fans? Anthony with Bleacher Bums Gaming, and last week we did a new thing, Deadball Diaries. We started, and we basically what it was. You can go back and look at it, but it was basically just commenting and listening to a interview done by Lawrence Ritter, who wrote the excellent, in fact, one of the best historical baseball books, The Glory of Their Times. And in the Deadball Diaries, I actually have the audio book of Glory of Their Times, which is compiled of the actual interviews Ritter did with the players. So it is their players basically speaking on tape, their voices, and sharing their memories directly, and not through printed form or been done by a narrator. So I thought that was fun, and it got some good response. So we decided, or I decided, I guess, I'm going to do another one. So today we are going to listen to, comment on, and react to the interview of Smokey Joe Wood. Of course, great pitcher for the Boston Red Sox. Actually, at one point, the equal of Walter Johnson at the peak of his career. And he'll talk about the epic, probably one of the most epic pitchers duels in baseball history that he had with Johnson back in 1912, which I will not spoil. I'll let him talk about that. So we're going to get to it. First of all, though, this video is brought to you by Suja, cold-pressed organic Mighty Dozen, filled up with apple, celery, cucumber, kale, collard greens, and paired with lemon, mint tea, ginger, spinach, spirulina, chlorella, and barley grass. Now, this is not quite the canned beef that you'll get on Kurt Berglund's Baseball World. Probably isn't as satisfactory to the palate. It doesn't taste bad. It doesn't taste like grass clippings either, but it is much healthier than a big can of chipped beef. So we're going the healthy route. I like to stay healthy, work out, eat right, all that good stuff. So that is our sponsor today. And for the YouTube monitors, I do not really mean that, and they do not pay me for advertising. I just like the drink. So let's get right to it. This is Smokey Joe Wood, circa 1966. The taped interviews with Lawrence Ritter for Glory of Their Times. Here we go. And like we did with the Davy Jones interview, we will stop it periodically to comment and offer our observations. Hope you enjoy.
Smokey Joe Wood, I hate to say it, but his name was really Howard. Smokey Howard Wood. The family went to a circus when he and his brother were kids, and there were two clowns there, Mo and Joe. And the brothers thereafter, one was called Mo and one was called Joe. So Smokey Joe Wood came from the Joe, but it really was Howard on his birth certificate. Smokey Joe Wood was in the major leagues for 15 years, from 1908 to 1922. He was with the Red Sox and the Cleveland Indians. He was one of the great pitchers of his era, hurt his arm, came back to the big leagues as an outfielder, and one year hit over 350 as an outfielder. Joe Wood, after his career as a ball player, became a baseball coach at Yale University. And prior to his death in 1985...
Just a real quick thing, very, very similar to the trajectory that Rick Ankiel took with the St. Louis Cardinals, where he came back and was actually serviceable as a outfielder after his pitching woes. Very different, though, with Wood. And as he talks about his injury, it more than likely was a rotator cuff, either a rotator cuff or what would be known now as the ulnar, the Tommy John injury, the ulnar nerve in the elbow. But very, very interesting parallel between Ankiel and Wood. And Wood, I believe, as an outfielder, was a .290 career hitter. So he, again, was serviceable after his worthiness as a pitcher had expired due to arm injuries.
When he was 95 years old, the president of Yale University Bartlett Giamatti, who later became the commissioner of baseball, presented him with an honorary Yale degree. He had never graduated from high school, and this pleased Joe Wood just tremendously. To be presented with an honorary doctorate by Yale University was a great thing in his life.
I often look back on it now. I see these Wild West pictures in the movies and on TV and so on. Now, when we lived in Colorado, Larry, and we went through all that in real life.
Yeah.
Those big stagecoaches with the guards sitting up with their rifles on the back end, guarding gold bullion coming down from the mines. We saw all that in real life. All of that.
It's just a movie to me, you know.
Of course, they enlarged a little on it in all the years that we were out there, which was 5 years. And I used to see these big buses every day coming down from the mines with 2 men on there with their rifles, 6-horse teams, of course. But all the ones you see now, their horses are just running like hell, you know. I never saw them off a trot. I never saw any one of them running like that in all those years.
In one of those record books that I have, it said something about the Bloomer Girls. What was all that about?
We come back from Colorado to Kansas in 1905. Well, I was playing up with this little town team of Ness City, Kansas in 1905 after I got there, and also in 1906.
Were you pitching?
Not necessarily, no.
Everything?
Everything.
Including
pitching and infield. I wasn't pitching, I was playing the infield.
That was a semi-pro team.
No, it wasn't even semi-pro, just a little town team.
Ness City.
Ness City, yeah. These were not the Boston Bloomer Girls. These are what they call the National Bloomer Girls out of Kansas City. 2 boys played regularly on the team. The third baseman they called Lady Madison, put on a wig. And then they had another pitcher by the name of Compton, called him Lady Waddell, and he wore a wig. Oh, they were advertised on posters several weeks before they got there, you know. That's where they did their publicity. They came in the fall of 1906 to play this exhibition game with us in Ness City. And I had a good day against them, and this Logan Galbraith, who owned the club, I believe he offered me $21 a week to finish the last 3 weeks with him. Dad had lost his money on speculation in western Kansas land. We were very poor, and I got this opportunity to go with him. I'd worked all my life as a kid here and there, making 50 cents or $1 or $4 a week or something like that. And had a chance to make this $20 a week, I suppose. But I never wore a wig.
Did people know that these were men, or?
Oh, they must have. They must have known. Although you get around those little country towns, they put those wigs on pretty good and so on, but they must have known. I didn't wear a wig.
Didn't they know you were not a girl? Didn't the audience?
Oh, sure, they knew I wasn't a girl.
Was that legal? I mean, was that...
Oh, yeah, sure, as far as the Bloomer Girls were concerned. Anybody except the farmer boys would know that these fellows with wigs on weren't girls. They had postcards with a...
Let's unwrap some of that. So, couple of things. This, obviously, baseball around the turn of the century. Most towns, small towns, had teams, and even in some of the larger towns, cities, whatever, there would be teams that were sponsored by factories or large businesses that were local, and this phenomena kind of existed in modern times, I guess you could say in the 80s, and it to an extent still does, but more so in the 80s and 90s, especially growing up in Utah, where they had 2 very accomplished men's fast pitch softball teams, where basically to get the elite players, these companies, one was Miller Toyota, and the other one was Page Brake. Those were 2 of the bigger nationally ranked fast pitch softball teams from Utah. So they would hire the companies, and of course Larry Miller, former owner of the Jazz, late Larry Miller, they would give these softball players jobs with the understanding that they would play on their fast pitch softball team. So a very similar concept here back at this point. And then the Bloomer Girls obviously were a barnstorming team, and barnstorming was huge, probably up until the 40s, really. And it's funny listening. Smokey Joe Wood, an elite arm talent, threw probably as hard as the hardest throwers in the dead ball era, obviously Walter Johnson, Noodles Hahn, who was a left-hander with Cincinnati in the early part of the 20th century. Wicked fastball. He, unfortunately, his career did not last due to arm injuries. And of course, Rube Waddell also threw very hard. So Wood is right up there with that company and probably just a notch below Walter Johnson in terms of velocity. So it's just interesting seeing that he never probably would have had this chance if not just playing for his town team, and this Bloomer Girls team happened to come through town. And that's really how a lot of ball players got discovered back in that point in time. There was no camps, no national showcases like they have now, and the scouting was much more limited because scouting was done by train, and sometimes major league teams would get tipped off, via telegram from a fan or somebody connected about a second baseman in Iowa or a good left-handed pitcher in, New Mexico. And if they thought it was worth a look, they would send out their scouts by train. So, very substandard by today's metrics, scouting network. So a lot of these great ball players were basically accidental discoveries. And the final thing there is the point of the kind of dig he gets in at the Farm Boys. Everybody would know the Bloomer Girls were not girls, except some of the Farm Boys was kind of funny. So I guess maybe they were a little bit isolated. Of course, in the time they were called rubes, which basically meant you weren't very smart or came from the country. I usually come from the country. So just thought it was funny that he kind of got that little dig in at the Farm Boys there. So here we go back to it.
The picture of the Bloomer Girls on it, and these girls would sell those things around. That's what they did mostly. We did have one good girl ball player, and you've probably heard of her. Her name was Ruth Egan, first baseman. And she grabbed that ball. She played first base with a catching glove, and she could hit pretty well.
What did you do in the locker room?
What locker room?
I mean, there was all girls except for the other.
We had no locker rooms in those days.
You went home from the ball game in uniform?
That's right.
Oh.
Well, we did that in the big league for years.
Yeah, I was going to say, and I would think, Laura, in the Davy Jones interview, we picked out something that you would have thought the Arthur would have known. Same with this. Big league teams back in the turn of the century or in the Deadball days, mainly, a lot of parks didn't have adequate clubhouse facilities, so they would travel via carriage in full uniform from their hotel to the ballpark, and it was quite a spectacle back in the day. And obviously, if the big league teams are doing it, these barnstorming teams, definitely the same thing.
We went out on buses and taxis later.
And your father, when you decided to become a professional, earn your living this way, your father didn't feel that you were letting the family down in some way?
No, he went. I was only 17 years old when I first reported my first professional job, and he went with me.
He went with you?
Oh, yes. Little old town of Hutchinson, Kansas, 116 miles from where we lived. Hutchinson, Kansas, in the Western Association. And that was the beginning.
How did they come to hear of you? They didn't have scouting systems in those days, or did they?
When I went to Kansas City the next year, in 1908 in the spring, I pitched against several major league clubs as they're coming up from the south, come through Kansas City. And that way, I imagine, my name got to some of the clubs, especially to Boston and Washington. And the Boston club sent a scout to look at me in Kansas City.
Did you get any kind of a bonus of any sort for signing?
No. Lord, no, you were tickled to death to be able to get to play.
Did you have any doubt that you would be a good ball player when you broke in?
When I first broke into professional ball, I didn't have that idea. But as I went along and was so successful with strikeouts and so on, I was pretty fast. I could throw a ball about as hard as anybody outside of Walter Johnson probably, and there wasn't much difference between us. But when I found out that I could throw that ball by a lot of these fellows, then it began to build up a little confidence, yes.
You didn't have very much trouble with control either, did you?
At the start, yes. When I first went up, yes. But afterwards, no. In a couple of years, I could put that ball in that hole. But most of the time, it was just rearing back and letting it go. You weren't throwing to... I was throwing to spots, sure. You had somebody that you knew couldn't hit a curveball low and inside. I might get in the clutch and get 2 strikes on him and put it low inside or something like that. But as a rule, I was so fast that I was just rearing back and letting him go.
And you threw a hard ball all the time.
That's right.
For 9 innings.
That's right. I wasn't smart enough to throw a change of pace, and I never threw over half a dozen curved balls, but I was fast. I could really throw that ball so that, you know, a lot of these fellows say they did this and so on. Very few fellows ever lived could throw a ball fast enough to have a hump on it. I happen to be one of them.
That's why they call you Smokey?
Yeah.
Who gave you that name?
A newspaper man by the name of Paul Shannon, who was on the Boston Post in Boston.
After you got to the big leagues.
Yeah.
You started with the Red Sox in 1908.
Mm-hmm.
And you were...
Well, I broke into Boston when I was only 18. The youngest man in the league, I think. I never saw a big league game till I broke into the big league.
Did you?
In a comment on what he's talking about, throwing hard all the time. Really, at that time in the game, most pitchers did not throw at full velocity or show their best stuff unless they got into jams. And one reason for that is the ball. In the dead ball era, oftentimes, if they could get foul balls back from the fans, the same ball would stay in play basically for the entire 9 innings if it was feasible and they were able to keep it in the park. And by that time, it was, you know, stained with dirt, tobacco spit, licorice, scuffed up. And because of that, a lot of the pitchers of that era, you know, they would ease up a little bit to save their arm and then only bear down when they had runners on base. Christy Mathewson was well known for that. He would nibble and pitch, and then when he got in a jam, that's when you'd see the screwball, and he'd throw a little bit more heat. And Wood and Johnson, were two of the guys from that era that were said to throw hard the entire game. Walter Johnson, because he had such an easy sidearm motion that he just, through basically freak of physics, was able to generate the velocity he did on it. But really, his throwing motion was a lot easier on the arm than the overhand motion that Joe Wood pitched with, which would explain, again, probably a shoulder, but more than likely an ulnar nerve elbow injury that derailed his pitching career. So, yeah, they're very, very uncommon for pitchers to give you 100% the entire 9 innings, which, again, was another reason they completed so many of their starts back then as well.
You think you'd make it when you got up there?
Well, after I pitched a few games, I knew I'd make it, because there was nobody as fast as I was except Walter Johnson in those days.
I meant to ask you how you were treated when you came up as a rookie with the Red Sox.
I wasn't looked down upon or shunned in any way. I think they paid just as much attention to me when I first came up as they did at any other time. I can't say that I was helped, but I never asked anybody a question. They didn't answer me truthfully, I don't think.
Was Tris Speaker there when you got there?
When I went to Boston, Speaker wasn't back yet that fall. He had been there, and they had sent him out to Little Rock. He came back in a month or something like that after I joined there. And the funny part of it was we started rooming together. We roomed together in the American League for 15 years, both Boston and Cleveland.
Tell me about him as an outfielder.
There was nobody close to him, I don't think, Larry. He played from here to the road, back to second base. But I say maybe a little bit further than that, near out the garage at the most. But, I'd say about 30, 40 yards back to second base. Of course, it was a dead ball in those days. But he could turn with a snap of the bat like that. He had that instinct, that he knew where the ball was going, and he'd turn and look over his shoulder and grab it.
He was really good.
Oh, he was the best of all time.
Yeah.
He has that reputation of being the best of
Yeah.
all time. They talk about DiMaggio and those, so on. They were in that Speaker's class. I never saw anybody with his equal, but all around, hitting and fielding and throwing and running.
Speaker wasn't much of a runner, was he?
Oh, yes, he was very fast.
I mean, on the bases.
Yes, but he didn't go in for base stealing like Cobb and Clyde Milan and Max Carey and that bunch. But he stole quite a few bases all the time.
And he could hit.
Oh, I say he could, yes, sir.
Was he a strong, well-built fellow when he was a young man?
Strong as a bull, yeah.
What was he like as a person?
Perfect. I don't think Spoke ever had an enemy. I say Spoke, that's what we always called him. Great person, great personality. Great fellow. You take your real friends like Speaker and I were like that, and I'd have gone to hell for him and he'd have gone to hell for me.
Is he the best baseball player you've ever seen?
No. Ty Cobb was the greatest player I ever saw, and any ball player will tell you that. Any of the old-time ball players. They won't even stop to think. Ty Cobb was the greatest ball player that ever lived. Ty Cobb would get on and beat you alone. I've seen many a time when he'd get on first base by bunting the ball to be sure to get on, bunt it, and then steal second, third, and home. He had every catcher in the league. It's crazy. He was one thought ahead of the average ball player. Now, Eddie Collins was a very smart ball player. I've seen Eddie have the ball ahead of Cobb. And this was an all-star game, an all-star series back in 1911 when I happened to be picked on an all-star club. I saw Eddie Collins have the ball ahead of Cobb, and Cobb was still sliding safe. By sliding by and grabbing it with his hand or some damn way. He'd do it one way or another as he saw it. Ty would cut you down. There's no doubt about that. He'd cut you down if you didn't give him a spot to go into that bag. If you give him a spot, he told many and many. I heard him tell him, give me.
So we're back on a familiar theme. And first of all, a speaker was renowned for probably playing the shallowest center field possibly in the history of the game. And to compare him to a modern, well, not necessarily current day player, but a more modern player. Very much like Willie Mays of his era, an excellent defensive player. Not a, well, actually did have good power. He is the all-time leader in doubles. And was more than adequate as a base stealer. You know, just a good all-around. He'd probably be considered a 5-tool player if he played today. But yeah, Speaker definitely one of the greats and a very good defensive outfielder, especially for the dead ball time. But as he gets into talking about Cobb, you know, interesting, and it's going to go down a familiar path where, you know, again, Cobb was just not well liked, dirty ball player, not at all popular amongst his peers. And, you know, just contrast him, though, and even Davy Jones says Cobb was a great ball player. But Jones, in the interview that we listened to in our first video, called Cobb out basically on his lack of work ethic and the way he took care of himself. And that wouldn't be as apparent to players that did not play with Cobb because they wouldn't have that intimate knowledge of him. So Wood here is basically just talking about his skills, which again were superior for his time. And more than anything, it was his mental approach to the game where basically every time Cobb took to the diamond, it was a 9-inning war, a battle for his life, and that's how he played. So he's going to get into some stories now about how Cobb was on the base paths and had a very, you know, some stories are exaggerated. There's no proof that Cobb ever sat around sharpening his spikes, as some people have said, but he definitely gave no quarter, and if you were in his way, you were going to get spikes in a place you probably didn't want them as the baseman. So,
Give me room to get in there, and don't worry. But if you don't give me room, I'll cut you out to get in there. Which is plain common sense, isn't it?
Yeah.
He did keep his spike sharp. There's no doubt about that.
Were you around in big leagues the time
and
that
stuff like that
Cobb
kind of
and
plays into
Lightweight
that legend,
were
but again,
battling for the
no
crown?
proof.
They chased the fellow out of baseball right then, right in Cleveland.
That's right. The time that, was it 4 or 5 hits that Lightweight got on bunts?
You know who it was? Red Corrigan. Well, that's the fellow that was playing third base for St. Louis.
Oh, then he was a rookie then.
Sure.
Yeah.
Red Corrigan was chased right out of the league then, and you never heard of him to come back in as a coach years and years and years later. Lightweight never hit from a bunt in his life. He got 4 hits that day, I think it was, from laying down bunts down the third baseman.
Yeah.
That's because Cobb was so disliked. Cobb was the most disliked ball player, one of the most disliked. I remember that this Butch Smith, who was a great catcher over there, Butch Smith used to kick hell out of Cobb about every day. He was about twice as big as Cobb, too. But Cobb would come right back and choose him the next day.
But you got along good with Cobb.
Cobb was one of my very best friends, yeah.
I wanted to ask you about Walter Johnson. Do you remember that 1912 game with Walter Johnson?
So just to, and this 1912 game is going to be interesting, but just to wrap up that piece about Cobb, again, Davy Jones talked about the Bosch Schmidt, who Schmidt was Detroit's catcher, about how Cobb and him scrapped, and you know that was apparently well known. They had no love between them. Wood makes it sound like they fought constantly, but that wasn't the case. So, yeah, just and interesting too that Wood is probably one of the few guys who considered Cobb a friend, at least amongst his peers as baseball players. So I just wanted to touch on that. But he's going to talk about this. Oh, and the event he was referring to when Nap Lajoie laid down 4 bunts against St. Louis. Him and Cobb were engaged in a race for the batting title, and the winner would get a brand new Chalmers automobile, which was a fairly luxurious auto for that time period, circa 1911. And the story goes that the St. Louis manager, because Cobb again was so hated, ordered his third baseman to play back in their game against Lajoie and basically entice him to lay down bunts. And Lajoie was not a swift player, especially at that stage of his career. He was a big man, more of a power line drive hitter, but he did lay down a multitude of bunts against the Browns, and it ended up with both men. There was percentage points differences, and historians have gone back and recalculated the averages, but the Chalmers Automobile Company ended up giving both men a automobile for that season. But it was definitely one of the first great controversies of the what you can call modern era of baseball.
Johnson?
Yes, very well. The reason that it was a big game, did you ever get the history of that game?
I think so, but tell me.
Well, there's 4 of us today that hold the American League record of 16 straight games, 16 straight wins without a defeat. Now, up at that time, Walter Johnson had his 16 and had lost his 17th. I had about 11. Well, old Foxy Clark Griffith comes in, and Walter Johnson should have the right to defend his record of 16 straight, so he challenged Joe Wood to meet Walter Johnson. Well, hell, we pitched against one another many and many times before, and even after that. There were very few pitchers ever lived, Larry, that had a fast enough ball where it would really rise. Well, I was one of them. Walter Johnson and I were the ones in those days. And so they advertised us like prize fighters with biceps and triceps and all that stuff. And that is the only time, all the time I was there, and I don't think since, the people who came to the game, the fans, were sitting right alongside the third base line and the first base line. We were sitting up, instead of sitting on our bench back where the benches are now, and where they were then, we were sitting on chairs right up alongside of those people that were along the line.
Was that in Fenway Park?
At Fenway Park.
Yeah,
that's the year it was opened. And I won 1-0 that day. But Walter Johnson to me was the greatest pitcher that ever lived.
You beat Johnson 1-0.
Oh, yes. And of course, my God, if he'd had the club behind me, him that I had behind me, he never would have lost a game. That's the unfortunate part of Walter's pitching. He had a bad club behind him all the time, and I had a good club. Walter to me, my God, he's the only pitcher that I ever hit against that I didn't know whether I swung under the ball or over the ball. I just missed it, that's all. And I don't know how, but you'd miss it.
They always tell me that Walter Johnson had a deadly fear of hitting a batter.
I don't think he ever had any deadly fear of it, but Walter would never throw it in. In fact, Walter and I had more or less of an unwritten law between us that we wouldn't throw curveballs to one another. And we just popped that fast one. He popped his fast at me, and I popped my fast at him. And one day he curved me and didn't tell me. Geez, I curved the life out of him then from then on. Yes, sir. I think he was the greatest pitcher that ever lived, because I don't think probably with the same natural ability, maybe Matty might have even been better, but Walter had the natural ability. My God, his arms would stretch from here over to there. When he spread out here, he was a foot past mine on each side. And a great big fellow, well over 200 pounds, and if he wanted to, he could throw that ball right by you. But to me, a man with natural ability, he was the greatest pitcher I ever saw. Matty with his fadeaway and so on, and Matty was, I don't know whether you ever saw him pitch or not, did you?
No, a little bit before my time.
Matty could start a curve there and he'd break it right down, come right down here. As a rule, a curveball won't break if it's high. It breaks when it's low. But he could throw that curveball to a fellow standing like this, and it'd be up here, and first thing you know, it'd be right down there. And there wasn't one pitcher in 1,000 could break a curveball high.
Cy Young, you watch Cy Young pitch.
We'll get to Cy Young in a minute, but a couple of things, and I'm not going to fact check anything Joe Wood says like I did with Davey Moore, who was 100%, or I'm sorry, Davey Jones, who was 100% on point with the stories he told. But just some interesting disparities in the story about him and Johnson pitching to each other. First of all, by all historical accounts, Johnson rarely, and I mean rarely threw anything but a fastball. It was just wind up and whip that pitch in. And it's funny, even in the beginning in this interview, Wood says he barely threw a half dozen curveballs in his career. So apparently, based on that story, after Walter Johnson curved him, all the curveballs that Wood did throw were to Walter Johnson to strike him out. But you know, obviously he probably did throw more curves, but it's just interesting because Walter Johnson was not known for anything off speed, not known for a curveball. It was literally just wind up, whip that big long arm, sidearm, and fire the ball past the batter. And you know, Johnson did have very good control, and he actually was in fear of hitting batters. That was probably his biggest fear as a player, that he didn't want to hurt somebody. And Wood will talk about the Carl Mays incident later in this interview with Ray Chapman, which is obviously the only on-field death in Major League Baseball still, thankfully, but horrific story. And Carl Mays is another character that is not well remembered by history, but we'll wait till we get to that. So, yeah, I just wanted to point that piece out. And again, there's no way to go back and fact check how many curveballs those two threw to each other, but you know, very, very interesting that he suddenly was a big fan of the curveball when it came to facing Walter Johnson. But definitely would have been fun to see those two go at each other. And that game that he talked about, the 1-0 win, where Johnson was looking to defend his consecutive wins title. Obviously a sellout crowd. They did hype it up like a prize fight, and it was to the point where there was literally overflowed. You know, and imagine that today. They had fans out on the field. They had ropes around the field, fans down the foul lines and in the outfield. You know, it was a big event, and one of those games that definitely a 1-0 win for the Red Sox did live up to the hype. And I do agree with him. If Johnson had pitched for a team like the Sox or the Indians, aka Naps, or Blues or Broncos as they were known in the early part of the century, or the White Sox even, he definitely would probably wouldn't be too far-fetched to think he could have maybe given a run at Cy Young's all-time win record. You know, he had 414 as it was, pitching for generally terrible Senators teams, and lost and won more 1-0 games than any pitcher in baseball history, a record that will probably never be broken, along with his 113 career shutouts. So let's see what Smokey Joe has to say about Cy Young now.
I was on the club with him.
He went forever then, man.
Yeah.
Cy was already past his peak when you saw him.
God, yes.
Could he still pitch?
Not too well, no. He was a big fella. He was bigger than Ruth, and he had a pot on him. He used to sit there in Boston with a fellow by the name of Fred Putnam that had run this place. He had a drugstore and a restaurant and rooming place where we had a flat. And they used to sit there and they used to kill a quart or two of liquor every night. He and Fred Putnam. He's a terrific whiskey drinker, old Cy.
How did he last so long under that?
Well, maybe he just started in the later years. I don't know. But I know he was there at the last. A fellow that really drank, and what we always claimed, a fellow should never take a drink until after a ball game in the evening. A fellow that happened to be a morning drinker and especially got away from anything but beer, he didn't last long.
With a few exceptions, you know.
Very few.
Yeah.
Like Grover Cleveland Alexander and Bugs Raymond, I know people like that. But that's the same today as it was then.
Yeah.
As far as rowdyism in baseball, I don't think there's any more then than there is now. The biggest trouble with all the youngsters in baseball are probably the other things, chasing the women. Damn women, you could have your phones taken out if they run you ragged. That was the big thing. And I don't think there's any more then than there is now.
Is there any game that sort of stands out in your mind as a game that really you got more kick out of than any other one, Howard?
I think I got more kick.
And matches Davy Jones' story that ball players back then took advantage of the female fan adoration as much or probably more than they do now. So just interested to hear these players corroborate some of the stories or descriptions of the time period.
Out of the first World Series game than I did out of any other game.
The very first World Series game you pitched when you beat Tesreau.
We got into the ninth inning of that game. We're leading 4-3, and there's men on second and third and one down. Fletcher is up first. I struck him out. Base hit beats us. A boot ties it. Little sacrifice fly ties. Then they sent up Doc Crandall. You heard of Doc Crandall. He never had struck out in the polo ground. They struck him out, too. So I had 2 strikeouts here in the real clutch. I pitched in 4 games. 3 of them, I guess, were against Tedrow. The last one that I worked in that I finished was against Matty, I believe. Well, Matty was at the tail end of his career then.
That was the game where Snodgrass dropped the top fly. Last game of the 1912 series.
Mm-hmm.
And it was following that, wasn't it, that Chief Myers and Merkel didn't touch a fly ball.
The real story of that never did come out. Christy Matthews was on.
And this is interesting. Chief Myers, by the way, is also another interview in this book that was very entertaining. But yeah, Fred Snodgrass is remembered as the GOAT of that World Series for dropping a fly ball that allowed the Red Sox basically to come back and win the game and henceforth take the World Series. But never ever should have been put in the position to drop that fly ball. And Smokey Joe is going to tell the story. Basically miscommunication, which he puts on Christy Mathewson between first baseman Fred Merkel and Chief Myers, his catcher, where Mathewson directed Merkel to basically let Myers take the pop-up, even though in that situation, especially in between the 2 positions, then and now, that should always be the first baseman's ball because he's coming toward the ball where the catcher is basically chasing it and has to look back almost over his shoulder and depending on the angle to make the catch. So, you know, this really has not been talked a lot when they talk about, you know, GOATs of that era, and I mean GOAT in the bad way by blowing a series like Merkel with missing first in the famous 1908 pennant race, and this muff by Snodgrass in the World Series. And you know, it dogged Snodgrass his entire life, and Snodgrass was actually a very capable baseball player, just like Fred Merkel was, and never seemed to avoid this. But again, he should have never been put in this position. And, you know, really you want to put the blame on anyone for the Giants' loss in that World Series. You probably have to look at Christy Mathewson, and Joe Wood will go into detail on that.
Own fault if that ball was dropped. Because it was right in front of Merkel, and he kept hollering for Myers, and Myers was running all the way down the line to first base.
That was your big year, wasn't it?
Oh, yes.
Well,
1912, I won 34 and lost 5.
I know.
And got 3 out of 4 in the World Series, 3 victories and 1 defeat. As a pitcher, I was at the top of the heap, right along with the best. Ball and I.
You sure were.
But my arm went bad right at the peak of my career. I never pitched without a sore arm after 1912. That was a tough break for me because you'd have heard a lot more about me if I hadn't hurt the arm. 23 years old, and the next year I couldn't throw.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I'd have set a record that they've been talking about yet, probably. And I'll never know what was wrong with the arm. Something went wrong. What it was, I'll never know. Christ, I was crazy about baseball. I loved to be in there. But I just couldn't. That's all there was to it. The old zip was not there. I think I started one game, didn't get too far, and I tried to finish a couple in. Each time I did, I couldn't raise my arm for about a week or 10 days. And I really thought that the arm was going to be all right, but I never did. Now, if it is nowadays where they might have shot in some cortisone or something like that in my shoulder, it might not have bothered me, but my arm was terrible.
So that leads to probably the fact that he had tore a rotator cuff, which would, you know, make sense with his throwing delivery and the fact that he said he couldn't raise his arm up after a start when he did throw the ball. And, you know, very sad. I mean, back then, if you were a pitcher, and that's, again, definitely says something for pitchers not going at 100% all the time. You know, there were no surgeries like there are now to go in. I mean, rotator cuff now, I've had both my shoulders done. Not fun. It's a painful rehab and recovery, but, you know, you get back to full strength. I can do everything now that I could do before. And obviously, Paul players back then did not have that luxury. So who knows, you know, Smokey Joe Wood maybe would have gone on to a career where he was talked about in the same breath as, you know, Walter Johnson, Sandy Koufax, Bob Gibson, Bob Feller, all the greats of the game. And as it is, basically in terms of pitching, he is just remembered for probably one of the finest individual seasons in history, that 1912 campaign.
So in 16 I didn't play at all, but in 15 I won 15 and lost 5 or 4.
I've been able to figure out you had a good season in 1915, you had a very
I
low
was only
earned run.
pitching about half the year, see?
Yeah, but you had a very low earned run average, didn't you?
Yes.
Very
I
well.
led the league in that.
And you won about 15 games.
And lost 5, but see, that's only half the number. I don't even pitch about every 2 weeks or something like that. But my arm was terrible. Next year I couldn't even play at all. I couldn't even sit like this and hold my arm there. I couldn't raise it.
What'd you do the next year?
Nothing. I stayed right up here and fished.
And then how did your arm feel the next year after that?
I went down during the winter of 15 and 16. I went to New York. I commuted to New York every Monday morning and back on a Saturday night. I went to a chiropractor down there behind locked doors all winter long. And then I worked out with Andy Coakley out in Columbia Gym. So I got in touch with Cleveland. They decided to take a chance, and they made a deal with Boston for me, and I went to Cleveland. They bought my contract because I told them I thought I was all right again. But I couldn't pitch. I tried it several times. If I pitched the equivalent of anything over 3 or 4 innings, I couldn't raise my arm for 2 or 3 weeks. So finally I got to a spot during the war in 18 that several of our fellows were called away, and they had several minor leaguers they had called back up and tried in the outfield, and they were out there getting hit in the head. And so finally the secretary of the club came down and they said, "Why the hell don't you put Woody out there? He's a pretty good ball player." So they did, and I was lucky enough to get a good start and hitting well and so on, so I played the outfield for like 7 years for Cleveland.
Wasn't it a strain to shift over from pitching to being an outfielder?
No, the only difference was as a pitcher, I was the top of the heap, and as an outfielder, I was just another ball player.
But you didn't have any trouble making the...
Oh, Lord, no. I could go get him as good as anybody.
And you did well as an outfielder.
Not too bad.
300 hitter, more or less.
Well, 1 year I was over 300. I think that's about the only year.
Were you always a good hitter when you were a pitcher, too?
Well, when I first went up, it was more or less of a joyride when I first went to Boston. But later on, when I figured that a hit from a pitcher now and then would help win a ball game, then I really got serious about it, yes. I was around a 290. I never was a 300 hitter. But 1 year I hit about 365 in Cleveland 1 year. Only time in my life I ever hit over 300.
Yeah, what happened to you that year?
I haven't any idea.
You batted 366.
I haven't any idea.
But I don't know of any case where a pitcher of such stature, a star pitcher way up there, whose arm went bad and he came back and made it as an outfielder, which is very rare.
Well, I think Babe and I were the only 2 fellows that ever played both in the outfield and as pitcher in the World Series.
You were on the Red Sox when Babe Ruth came up.
Oh, yes. He came with us in 14.
Yeah,
I went to
what
Boston.
was...
And just one addition to that group that's from this time period actually is Lefty O'Doul, who is also interviewed in this book, which, again, I would think that the author would know that, though he did not have the success early when he did pitch that Wood did in his brief time as a pitcher for the Red Sox. But
What was this kid like?
You could see that he was a good ball player, and he loved it.
Did he have, even as a youngster, the piano legs and the big torso?
He had the piano legs, but he wasn't so big, no. He was a slender kid. Slender and well built.
Was he a pleasant person?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
Friendly person?
Sure. I laugh at him yet when I think of him. He was the goddamnest man you ever saw in your life. That's all there was to it.
As a kid?
Many a time, his roommate was Ernie Shore. Many a time, Ernie went up to go to bed, and his dame would be in the bed right alongside of him.
As a kid?
The babe.
He was only a little kid, though, or a big kid.
Oh, he was a big kid.
Yeah.
Well, he was just a big hick, a big farmer boy. He come out of this convent, he come out of this home there in Baltimore. He never had been out at all until the year before. He just didn't know what it was all about, that's all. He'd been in this home for years.
Was he?
He was very crude. I wouldn't, or you wouldn't, or anybody else that ever really knew Babe as he was. They want their kids to follow along in his footsteps. Of course, when I knew him, he wasn't drinking much, but I wound up drinking it pretty well. But his main fault when I knew him was women. Last time I saw him, he had a couple of blondes up here at Harry Harper's over in Jersey.
With respect to girls, was Babe more of a chaser than most?
Oh, yes. He'd go after a snake if they'd hold it for him. He'd drop by and he'd always confided in me quite a little. He'd say, well, I bet 10,000 on this race today and so on, which he did.
I would go after a snake if they held it for me. I'll take I'll dispute one of Joe's points. I wouldn't necessarily classify Babe Ruth as a country boy or a hick as he did. In fact, probably just the opposite, and that was one of the main reasons he ended up in that home in Baltimore. Is, you'll see pictures even where a young Babe is with his father behind the bar of their family saloon. So I would actually say Babe Ruth was exposed to definitely many times more than a lot of average people or average youth were in that time in America, and definitely not the naivety of a farm boy. There's legendary stories about Ruth's prowess or I guess love of the ladies. It goes right up there with his love of hot dogs and beer and food. And he would often use, and I'll be crude for a minute, but a quote that was often attributed to Ruth. And again, people just did not speak like this at that time, and that's obviously why Wood labels Ruth as a crude person. But writer in a book quotes Ruth as saying one time how he was all excited because the Yankees had been on a road trip, and he loved his fans. Ruth definitely loved his fans, and he was excited to get back to his hotel room and check out his mail. And the way he categorized that is, I bet by the time I get back to my room, there'll be a stack of mail for me as big as my penis. And Ruth apparently had a fondness for describing things in sexual terms like that, or referencing against his dick, basically. So, yeah, interesting there that Ruth definitely beloved, but he for sure was one of the cruder characters of the game, especially for that time in America.
About that. They framed on him for several years. They cut him down to Cuba and took him for all he had one winter. Babe Ruth could never manage himself, let alone manage the ball club, and the club owners knew that. They wasn't going to let him manage their ball club. That's one of the reasons why they could take Ty Cobb now. Ty Cobb was the greatest ball player that ever lived, and he figured that the other ball players should do things as well as he did, and they couldn't do it, and for that reason he was a bad manager.
How was Speaker as a manager? Now,
Wonderful. Everybody played for him, loved him.
There was this mess with Hal Chase in 1918, where Christy Mathewson was managing Cincinnati, and Mathewson got rid of Hal Chase because he suspected him of trying to throw a game, and McGraw took him on. That was always a strange thing, too, but Hal Chase spent a year with McGraw after Mathewson didn't want him anymore.
Hal Chase, do you remember I told you about 1911 when they picked me on an all-star club? Hal Chase was on that club. He was begging me to get Walter Johnson in a crap game, and I wouldn't do it, but I saw him get in this crap game, and I see he could spin those across there on the corners and bring them up 7s and 11s and so on whenever he wanted it. We started playing poker, and Hal was on my left. And we were playing a pretty fair poker game, I forget, for us, 50-cent limit or $1 limit or something like that. Anyhow, I was 40 or 50 bucks loser, and Hal was a good friend of mine. He says, "Don't cut my cards." He didn't tell me out loud like that, but he just told me, "Don't cut my cards this time." I didn't, and Christ, he dealt me a set of 4s. So I said to myself, maybe a coincidence, may not be. So I threw him in the deck. I wouldn't play him. So the next time, I didn't cut his cards, he dealt me another set of 4s. So after that, I cut him, that's all. So I know he could handle them.
Was Hal Chase as great a fielder as they say he was?
Oh, yes. Wonderful. And Hal was strictly an individual player. Hal Chase would be playing first base, he'd go over and field the ball on his right, and he'd throw that ball over that bag, whether the first baseman was there or not, he'd throw it right on into the dugout. That's what I mean by being an individual player. He shouldn't throw that ball unless he could see who he's throwing it to, but he'd make his play and right over that bag, whether the pitcher was there or not. I've seen him do that several times. Chase and Harry Lord. Harry Lord was on our ball club in Boston. He never pulled anything like that when he was in Boston. But he and Chase got mixed up with something on the White Sox club, and they chased him out.
I read a book that just came out about the Black Sox. And in this book, the author says that these 8 men were also throwing games in the 1920s as well as throwing the 1919 World Series. You were a big league ball player then. Did you people sense anything was wrong before it was exposed?
We didn't sense too much, but our last series with the White Sox, we saw they weren't out to win. I think they could have beaten us. I don't believe that we could have won in 1920 if this thing hadn't happened with the White Sox, because they had one of the finest ball clubs, my God, that ever was put together. Sicot used to be in Boston when I was there. I knew Sicot very well. And he told me in the Winton Hotel that they didn't dare win in 20. We don't dare win.
Before the World Series? Before the
season was
1920?
Before the season was over.
The whole business is so funny that it's hard to understand. For instance, in that book, Sicot comes out as a real grade A type of human being. And the author doesn't understand either. Why did these guys do that? I know they needed money and so on, and they were paid bad, I guess.
They didn't need money. Chick Antle, he was the ringleader in that whole thing. He always was a louse. Everybody knew he was a louse. Sicot was on the same order, only not so openly. Sicot was a trickster. He was the one that paraffined that ball. Sicot and Danforth and some more of those, they put paraffin in the seams and shined it on their pants, see?
Now, that was illegal in those days.
All those things were illegal.
How could a man get away with it for years if it was illegal? Everybody talked about Eddie Sicot's shine ball, so that the umpire must have known
They couldn't see him put it on there. They'd throw the balls out on him. That's the reason they cut out the spitball, in order to get away from this trick stuff of the emery and the mud ball and the shiner. Of course, it was all cheating. Sicot was, they used to call knuckles. He used to throw a knuckleball until he got this shiner, and then he was practically invincible. You can't hit that sailor ball. That's the only thing that made Sicot a great pitcher.
And a man like Felsch, a great outfielder. A man like Jackson, one of the greatest hitters of all time.
Jackson, to me, it was a pitiful case. Jackson couldn't read nor write. He used to always take his roommate to go to the dining room, and his roommate would order a meal, and they'd say, "Bring me the same." He couldn't read. And naturally, somebody said something, he'd follow him, probably. Felsch was that type of fella, too, but not Sweet Risberg, not Buck Weaver, not Eddie Sicot, not McMullen. That's what I can look over this series, and I can't understand how Weaver could have been connected to that thing. The only way I can figure that Weaver was connected was that they mentioned it to him and he wouldn't report it. Now, there's Claude Williams. He's no dumbbell. There was only a couple of fellas that were really morons on that club, and that was Happy Felsch and Joe Jackson.
So, interesting account. And the book they're talking about, which was released shortly before these interviews was done, was Elliot Asanoff's 8 Men Out. And so many fallacies in that book, and for so long it was taken as the Bible of what happened there. It really was not well researched, and there's been greater books, or better books I should say, that have come out since that time. One is Cleaning, God, I've got the book and I can't remember the name, but I think it's Making the Black Sox White or something like that. But where, the rumors back then, or I guess the fallacies presented in the book, was Charlie Comiskey was cheap and basically forced his players to throw that series. And it's not true at all. At one point, the White Sox had a payroll that was among the highest in baseball during that time period, and they did have one of the greatest teams in. They could have been a dynasty on par with some of John McGraw's Giant dynasties and Connie Mack's A's teams around the turn of the century. Obviously all owners were cheap back then, as cheap as they could afford to be, because they had a monopoly and they had the reserve clause in the contract. So players really had no power. It was all with the owners. But still, one of the biggest fallacies was that Comiskey had the lowest payroll in baseball, and that was far from the truth. And the other thing that came up in that book and in the movie also was that Sicot had a provision where he'd get a bonus if he won 30 games, and it's presented in the book and the movie as though Comiskey did not let him pitch, and that's just not the case. Sicot had a sore arm. He did have opportunities to win 30 games before he was basically shut down in preparation for the series later in the season, again due to his arm being lame, and he did not come through. So it wasn't where he was purposely benched so that he would not get his 30-win bonus. That was another of the misrepresentations in that story. But Smokey Joe Wood hits it right on the, the nail on the head. The true culprits here, Hal Chase was involved in that. He was the one who, because of his gambling ties to Rothstein and some of the people that ran in those circles in New York, because Hal Chase played a large portion of his career with the Highlanders. He was one of the key figures in that scandal. And the ringleaders on the White Sox were, as he mentions, Chick Gandil, who was basically a thug. He was, again, a terrible person and right up Chase's alley. And Swede Risberg as well was also a bit of a tough guy. And, the two of them were basically the ones that pushed this. Buck Weaver loved the game of baseball, by all accounts, played his heart out in the World Series, had a good World Series. Joe Jackson had a good World Series. The thing with Weaver that got him banished is he was complicit in knowledge to what was going on. He didn't report them. And, again, being a guy who maybe had some fear of Gandil. Joe Jackson basically came out and said that he had, was scared of Risberg and Gandil. They were hard men. And, again, Jackson illiterate, not at all educated, very, very gullible and, subject to being coerced. And Wood sums it up very well in terms of that whole series. It was those two guys, and Seacott was probably looking to make a big payday. Lefty Williams had every intention of going out and trying to win the World Series, and gamblers allegedly got to him and threatened his family, so he threw that final game that the White Sox lost that wrapped things up for the Reds. And Happy Felch, well, again, it goes with nicknames. Smokey Joe Wood, Smokey because he was fast. They do that, or put Bullet in front of your name. If you were a country boy or a hayseed, your nickname was Rube. Happy was for people that maybe weren't too smart and just kind of going through, life, rolling with the punches. Chief was given to pretty much every player of Native American descent. Dummy, if you were a deaf player. Dummy Hoy is an example, who's credited for basically bringing about the umpire arm signals on ball and strikes, was a deaf mute. So that was kind of the way nicknames a lot of times came to fruition in that early part of the 20th century, and a lot of ethnic nicknames as well. So, yeah, I think a good take overall from Wood on the Black Sox scandal. And again, I might do a more in-depth video of that at some other time, but Asimov does not do that true story any justice in his book 8 Men Out, in my opinion.
Gandil retired the next year and never went back to baseball.
He never had a friend in baseball. He was a terrific person.
You pitched against Joe Jackson. Was he as amazing a hitter as they say?
Oh, yes. Yes, sir. He was one of the very best that ever lived. Joe Jackson would stand up there and he'd swing from his tail and practically throw himself down. But if he got 2 strikes on him, he'd choke up a little on his bat.
The other book I read was a biography by Ty Cobb. And at the end of the book, he has a whole section that was all news to me on some mess up with him, you, and Tris Speaker and Dutch Leonard. And would you tell me what that was all about?
I will. I'm not going to tell you details because I wouldn't tell you too much about this thing. It stinks. When Dutch Leonard got through in Detroit, Cobb was the manager. And for that reason, he had a gripe against Cobb. And then he wanted Speaker to take him on over in Cleveland, and Spoke wouldn't take him on. And for that reason, he got sore at both of them. Well, in 20, there was a dispute over some betting in Detroit. And in order to get even, Leonard claimed that did this and that and so on. And there was a bet placed on the ball game. But it was not against our club. It was on our club. See, I was the guy that bet the dough. I had charge of the money. Well, I handled this through a gate tender in Detroit who contacted the bookies. And the money was bet, the money was collected, and this little son of a gun come down. We knew him very well, this gate tender in Detroit, and brought this money down to the train as we were leaving Detroit. And I gave him, after keeping equal splits for 3 fellas, I gave him the extra money, which amounted to about $30 or $40, for placing the bet. And this was just the same as betting on a prize fight or anything else. We bet on ourselves. There was nothing crooked about it on our part.
How often did teams bet on themselves?
Never. Never. That's the only bet I ever made in my life, and that is because somebody else wanted to bet it and I handled the money. But this thing in 20 wasn't exactly on the up and up, I gotta admit that. Because I knew from what Sycott had told me in Cleveland that the White Sox didn't dare win. But I did know through a couple other fellas on the Detroit ball club that they weren't going to play their heads off to beat us. That wasn't going to say we were going to lay down and give you the game. They didn't. That wasn't said. Well, anyhow, I knew that the White Sox didn't dare win that year. And this got back to Landis, and he had a letter that I had written. And Landis called me over to New York and says, "You write that letter?" And I said, "I sure did. There was my name on it." And Leonard had blackmailed Navin in Detroit for so much for that letter, and he still kept copies of it. And then he went ahead and tried to blackmail, I don't know how the hell he tried to get some more money out of somebody out of that, by going after Cobb and spilling this whole story, which was true. I was at a World Series with Landis down in New York, and he says, "This is Landis." I knew Judge Landis very well. The judge says, "Are you going to have any trouble over this thing, Joe?" And I says, "I don't think so." He says, "You let me know if you do." And I says, "I'll make a trip up to New Haven."
There was a letter you wrote.
Yeah. Leonard, there he kept this letter that I had written him after I got home here one winter. I wrote him out in Fresno a letter, same as I'd write to my brother. I trusted him, and I wrote him this letter, and he kept it and cashed in on it. I understand he got $12,000 or $15,000 the first from Navin in Detroit. Then they quashed it for a while, and then he come out with it again. But he kept the letter all the time.
The letter had that much dynamite in it.
Yeah. The letter quoted the amount of money it was bet, and his share was enclosed in the letter. I loaned that son of a bitch $200 to buy his first motorcycle in Boston when he first joined us. And he made the crack that he didn't mind what he was doing to Cobb and Speaker, but he hated Hurt Woody. But nevertheless, he did it. That dirty little son of a bitch of a Leonard. He died a millionaire, but he died young. And a great little pitcher, too. But he was a first-class crook.
How did Speaker and Cobb get involved in it?
Cobb and Speaker put up some of this money to make the bet. And Leonard broadcast this thing because Cobb let him go and Speaker wouldn't take him on.
Is it for that reason that both Cobb and Speaker left their jobs at Cleveland and Detroit?
Yeah. But they didn't get out of baseball. They went to the athletics. I'd like to see what Cobb had to say about it because I don't believe Cobb would tell the real dog. They got together with an attorney in Detroit. My greatest friend spoke, Cobb. And they got a bunch of stuff written up and typewritten and then deposited in a vault in the bank in Cleveland. And if they would have chased Cobb and Speaker out of baseball, this would have all come out.
Cobb has a whole chapter on it. He doesn't hide it at all.
Well, he didn't hide something, but he didn't tell it as it was. I'll bet you $1 million. I don't believe Cobb could afford that to tell that story. Yes, I know the story to be true. I have never told that to a soul in my life. I haven't even told it to my brother. Well, I didn't tell you anything that wasn't straight and on the level, I'll tell you that. That's one reason why this thing did really hurt me, because that's the first and only accusation in my life I ever had against me. I know it.
You were one of Cleveland's when Ray Chapman was killed, weren't you?
I carried him off the field.
So before we get to Chappie's story, yeah, my take on that whole thing, I think Dutch Leonard tried to capitalize on everything that was coming out about the 1919 World Series. It was very, very common for baseball players to bet on games back then. A handful of them bet to where they were in a position to basically fix games and hurt their teams. Hal Chase, of course, probably the biggest offender there. With Speaker and Cobb, their bets, and again, you shouldn't be betting on your own team regardless, but they weren't betting in a way where they would try to fix games. They would bet, or sometimes, I guess sometimes make gentlemanly agreements, which I guess you could construe as fixing, but they were basically betting on their teams to win for the most part. So my take on that whole Dutch Leonard story, and he was another one that was basically trying to capitalize on a big story at the time and get revenge on Cobb and Speaker for not furthering his career. But the way he tried to present it to get them thrown out of baseball was embellished, and again to benefit him, which you can based on Wood's story. And I don't know how you fact check or verify that, but Leonard obviously did probably profit somewhat from this, as well as even from being involved with the bets. But yeah, just again, every time something like of that magnitude, meaning the 1919 World Series, happens, you will definitely have people that come out and try and throw others under the bus or whatever. So I guess that was the gambling scene, or that gambling fiasco is maybe not a good comparison, but baseball's Me Too moment, I guess. But maybe that's a terrible comparison, but very similar in that other people tried to exploit that. So last story here will be about Ray Chapman and Carl Mays and the tragic pitch that killed Chapman in that 1920 game.
Leslie Nonemaker now, yes.
It must have been terrible.
It was, because this dirty louse of a Carl Mays, who incidentally was quite a pitcher. I understand, I don't know this for sure, but he made the crack to some of the fellows that he was going to take Chappie out of there that day.
Is that right?
In fact, after he hit him back there at the base of the skull, after he hit him, he went in and picked up the ball and threw it to first and raised hell with the umpires because they didn't call him out. And Chappie never did come to.
You knew Stanley Kowaleski?
Oh, yeah. He and I used to play three cushions together all the time. Three cushion billiards. He's running a gas station out at South Bend, Indiana.
He was a great pitcher.
Yes, he was. He was one of the best spitball pitchers I ever saw. Yeah, a great competitor. He won, incidentally, he's one of the pitchers that won 3 games in one World Series, but that was a 5 out of 9 series against Brooklyn in 20.
And you were in that series too, weren't you?
I was an outfielder in that series. Yeah.
You must have been there the day that Bill Wormsgans made the unassuming.
Oh, sure.
Did you know what the hell happened? All of a sudden, bang, 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 3 outs.
Sure, you can see it. When he caught this ball, he went over and tagged second base, and the other fellow ran right into him. That was your triple play.
You were on a college faculty for how many years?
I was on no college faculty. I was a baseball coach, and that was all.
How long did you coach at Yale?
20 years. 1923, starting in the spring of 23 through 42.
How did you get to go to Yale? How did that come about?
Fellow likes baseball. He stays around it as long as he can. And I was just about through because I'd already been in the league for 15 years. My arm had gone bad, and I was just another ball player as an outfielder, so Spoke came and asked me what I'd like to go, and I told him sure. Because in those days, our youngsters they were very young. We'd come home off a trip for 3 or 4 weeks. The kids wouldn't know who I was, so I was more or less of a homebody, and I thought I'd rather be so that I'd be around the kids and the family more. So I accepted the offer to go there. They took over my big league contract, paid me the same money as I'd getting in Cleveland.
Did you enjoy those 20 years?
I can't say that I enjoyed it as much as playing myself, because it's much easier to do a thing yourself if you have the ability than it is to try to tell some kids how to do it.
Yeah.
And that is one of the toughest things to do at Yale. These boys would rather come out and make an athletic team than they would to graduate Phi Beta Kappa. They come out and here I am, make a ball player out of me. And you knew damn well the minute you saw them, they couldn't play ball. That is the toughest job we had, was to cut those boys off of the squad.
Any good ball players come out of there that later played professional baseball?
Very few. There's a class of boys that goes to Yale, Harvard, and Princeton that, as a rule, have something bigger in mind when they get out than to go into professional ball.
But you still enjoy baseball very much.
Oh, Lord, yes, I do.
Even to watch it.
I stopped by on these little midget league games. Yeah.
If you had to do it all over again, would you be a ball player like you were?
No, yes. I had to do all over again. The chances are I would have saved my arm a little. I used to love to throw. I had such a good arm. I used to like to see that ball go, and I used to stand and practice as a catcher to throw to second base and so on. And just rear back and let her go. I probably wouldn't have done all that. I'd probably saved my arm like Whitey Ford does. He's a little kink or something, he goes and gets out and stuff like that. I think if Mickey Mantle hadn't been plagued with this trouble he's had for these years, I think he's one of the greatest ball players that ever lived. As I said when he first went in there, I made the crack. I said, he'll make them forget about Joe DiMaggio. And I think if he'd have been whole all the time, I think he would have. I was a lot like Mantle when I first started. My first year with the Red Sox, I had a broken toe. And later on, I had appendicitis and different things. And I only really pitched 3 years, 10, 11, and 12. But even at that, I won 115 games practically in those 3 years. But I used to love to be in there. I don't know of anything that I would rather have done.
Not very many men can say that.
In fact, as I've always said, my life has been a vacation, and if I'd have played ball for nothing if I could have afforded it. I know that's all I lived for when I was a kid, was to play baseball.
So that is Smokey Joe Wood, the actual taped interviews with Lawrence Ritter from Glory of Their Times. I do wish he'd spoken a little bit more about the Carl Mays, Ray Chapman incident. And I don't know. There's a book out there. Actually, it's one that I've been meaning to get for a long time that I haven't, called The Pitch That Killed, which goes very much into detail about this. And, of course, the people involved in this. But I don't know about his comment of Chapman's crack, that he was going to take Chapman out. Chappie, by all accounts, was beloved throughout Major League Baseball, very popular player. Mays, pretty much just the opposite, not a very popular player. But I don't know that, I don't know of any animosity, and maybe the book will shed light on that. But I don't know of anything between them that would make Mays say that. I do know Mays had a very well-deserved reputation for throwing at batters. And the way Wood recounts it, where after the ball hit Chapman, Mays did field it. It happened, the crack was so loud, and this was late in the game, and it was starting to get dark, so it was hard to see. So you accompany that, and Chapman had squared to bunt, actually. You put all those factors together. So Chapman would have had his head more in the strike zone. It's hard to see. The ball is stained. More than likely, Chapman never saw the pitch that struck him. And Mays actually did field it and throw to first base. Because of the sound of the ball hitting Chapman's skull, it sounded like a crack of the bat. It was that loud. So that part is true and has been corroborated. I would like to think Carl Mays wasn't a despicable enough of a human being that he would have intentionally gone after, Chapman, or made the comment that he was going to go after him. He just, in general, was a pitcher that had a reputation, and again, a well-deserved reputation, of coming in high and tight and throwing at batters, and that was there throughout his career. And the other thing that made him more lethal, especially in the elements of this at-bat where it was getting dark and the ball stained, he was a submarine pitcher, so he released the ball down around his knee. So it basically came off his shoe tops and was even harder to pick up, based than it would be if he was coming overhand at that time of the day. But one thing I want to just conclude with Wood is, and it's pretty much a common theme when you listen to these guys and you hear, towards the end of the interview where he's just reflecting on his life and his life in baseball, the absolute joy that these players all had, in playing the game and being a part of it. And I think that's one thing that comes through in all the interviews. And that's one of the pleasurable things for me to listen to hear that joy. And, they didn't make a lot of money back then. A lot of them went on to be successful, like Davy Jones, very successful, and Wood. And, if we do more of these, which I think I will, but depending on who we do, Hans Lopert, as an example, was one of those ball players that was not at all fortunate in later life. And, but probably as gracious and as grateful for his time in baseball as anybody interviewed. And so it's one of the real joys to listening to this, and that's why I actually love the fact that it's the actual players, their voices, telling their stories as it was dictated to Larry Ritter, which he later put into the book. But hope you like this one as well, and we will decide who we're going to do next. Maybe Sam Crawford, maybe Chief Myers. But I hope you all have a great night. Thanks for checking this out. If you like that, please hit the thumbs up and subscribe to the channel, and we will see you later. Anthony with Bleacher Bums Gaming. Hope you all have a great night. Thank you.